At the end of the Second World War, the hunt was on to bring a number of savage and brutal war criminals to justice, and many were sent crashing through the gallows at the hands of Allied executioners. The Einsatzgruppe during World War II were some of the most disgusting war criminals in history, and these were people who rounded up millions of civilians in the East, and they carried out massacre and mass executions on an industrial scale. There are still today many victims of the Einsatzgruppe death squads who lay in mass graves on the outskirts of their towns and settlements. But inside of American-controlled prisons, there were some Einsatzgruppe commanders who were executed, and some even became victims of the notorious botching US hangman John C. Woods. In this documentary, we look at 5 members of the Einsatzgruppe who were condemned and executed for their heinous actions. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Otto Erlandorf was born on the 4th of February 1907, and he grew up inside of a family of farmers. It's assumed that he had a rather normal upbringing, but when he was 18 he joined the Nazi Party and was considered one of the earliest members. Thousands of younger people across Germany began to become attracted to the politics of Hitler and the Nazis, but Erlandorf the following year joined the SS, and at this time they were not the paramilitary brutal force that they would later become. They were nowhere near as powerful as Hitler's brown shirt CSA. But in the years following, Erlandorf went to university and studied economics and law, and he also became a doctor of law, and men who had this amount of knowledge, who were also Nazis, would be seen as useful by Hitler. But Erlandorf threw himself into the Nazi Party's regime as their power over Germany increased, and he taught in Nazi schools in Berlin. He was seen as a good lawyer who often intervened with debates between the SS and other organisations, and in 1937 he joined the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. It was his job to help in the arrest and roundup of those men and women who opposed Hitler, and specifically he was involved in the economic side of the organisation. But Otto Erlandorf continued to rise throughout the ranks of the SS, and he did gain a number of senior positions and promotions, but he would upset a number of people, and he worked to collect intelligence from secret agents, and some in the Nazi Party disliked his work. This included the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who once described Otto Erlandorf as an unbearable Prussian who had no sense of humour. But he was a powerful man inside of the SD, and he continued to carry on the brutal work of the Nazi Party, especially as the persecution of people ramped up across the nation. However, as the Second World War raged across Europe, Erlandorf was recruited by the head of the SD, Reinhard Heydrich, to carry out a role in which he would be incredibly ruthless and brutal. The man who would be happy sitting behind a desk a lot of the time would now be on the front lines of the Second World War, arranging execution squads, which were known as the Einsatzgruppe. Heydrich appointed Erlandorf to become the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, and these saw action in the region of the Crimea. The Einsatzgruppe were the horrific death squads that followed the advances of the German army. These SS executioners would round up civilians in a settlement or a small town. They would then sort through the population, then lead those who were to be executed to the edge of a town or a concealed area. Here these people were forced to dig huge pits which would become their graves, and in small groups the civilians were led into the pits, where the executioners would stand on the edge, aiming their rifles at them, then take a fatal shot. Others were led into the pits and were told to lie on the corpses of those before an executioner administered a shot in the back of their necks. It was cold-blooded slaughter, and the Einsatzgruppe were responsible for the slaughter of millions. Erlandorf's executioners, specifically Einsatzgruppe D, were the smallest of the forces, but they were helped out in their murderous actions by men from other nations, and they continued their slaughter throughout different Soviet lands. His men were attached to the 11th Army. They would follow their advances, and his group were responsible for a massacre in December 1941 at Simferopol, which resulted in over 14,000 people's deaths. In this region where he operated, over 90,000 people were killed by his actions and his unit. Erlandorf himself did not like the use of the shot of the back of the neck, and he would prefer to order his execution squads to shoot like a normal firing squad from a distance, so that the executioners did not accept as much responsibility for their actions. He banned any contact between the firing squads and the victims, and as many as 3 executioners with their rifles were to shoot one person. He also told his men not to steal any of the victims' property and instigated a military-style execution to the proceedings, and it was one of his executioners that said, "A man is the lord over life and death when he gets an order to shoot 300 children, and he kills at least 150 himself." Otto Erlandorf was there on the front lines, and he was there witnessing the killing. He was approached by Himmler to use gas vans to slaughter people too, but Erlandorf stated that his men refused to use them as they found burying the victims too much after. He saw these as impractical and said that it would take too long to kill, but Otto Erlandorf was a man who was incredibly devoted to the Nazi cause, and he never complained once about the murderous actions. He did, though, once complain about the actions of some of the other soldiers from other nations he was overseeing in his death squads, who were committing scores of atrocities as well as being the executioners. But as well as being responsible for the slaughter squads, Erlandorf also had other jobs, such as being the Deputy Director General for the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. He was seen as a man who would be of use by Hitler, and he even made plans for the future of Germany when he believed the war would be won. However, as the war turned against the Germans, it was clear to Himmler and high-ranking SS members that one day they would be hunted for being barbaric war criminals. Himmler instructed those close to him to obtain false papers and assume new identities, but Erlandorf was involved in Heinrich Himmler's flight to Flensburg, and he actually was arrested by the British in May 1945, and shortly after this Heinrich Himmler would take his own life after his capture. Erlandorf was interrogated, and he would during these interviews tell of the horrific actions of the German army in the east, and he was later brought to the Einsatzgruppe trial. The court proceedings tried to punish those men who were the commanders and leaders inside of the Einsatzgruppe, and they were said to have been responsible for the murders of over 1 million people. Otto Erlandorf was seen as one of the most powerful defendants, and he was the chief defendant. He also gave evidence that was used against the other war criminals, and was said to have been a reliable source of information. He was a devout Nazi, but he was a man who hated corruption, and he had a strong commitment to his duty. During his trial he claimed that he was a loyal Nazi, and he admitted that he acted properly, and what he had done was not wrong at all. He had no remorse for his actions, and he believed the slaughter he oversaw was justified. Later the prosecutor involved in his trial would outline Erlandorf's comments, and he said, when Erlandorf was asked to verify that his unit had murdered 90,000 Jews, the SS general began to quibble. He said he could not confirm it. The reason given was that sometimes his men exaggerated the body count. Would the general care to venture an estimate? No. Was it perhaps 80,000 or over 70,000? That was possible. Or perhaps 100,000? Maybe. And were there many Jewish children amongst those who were killed? Yes, of course. But, added Erlandorf, he never allowed his men to do as some other units did. He told his men never to use infants for target practice, nor smash their heads against a tree. He ordered his men to allow the mother to hold her infant to her breast and to aim for her heart. That would avoid screaming, would allow the shooter to kill both mother and child with one bullet. It saved ammunition. Erlandorf said he refused to use the gas vans that were assigned to his companies. He found that when the mobile killing vehicles arrived at their destination, when they were supposed to dump their asphyxiated corpse into a waiting ditch, some of the captives were still alive and had to be unloaded by hand. His troops had to drag out corpses amid vomit and excrement, and that was very hard on his men, Erlandorf claimed. At the trial he tried to state that the actions of the Einsatzgruppe were aimed at securing the newly occupied areas, and he claimed it was necessary to make sure that the occupations of these regions went smoothly. But this did not win over the court, and he said that his firing squads were no worse than the press-button killers who dropped the atom bomb on Japan. But for his actions, Otto Erlandorf was sentenced to death in April 1948. He was transferred to Landsberg prison to await his execution, and he spent 3 years behind bars before it was time for his date with the executioner. On the 7th of June 1951, he was led out to his prison cell and was accompanied by American military policemen and also a priest, who was there to give him spiritual guidance in his final moments. It was just past midnight, and Erlandorf was led up to the gallows in the courtyard, and he was then helped up the stairs of the execution device and structure after he had his legs and arms secured behind his back. The executioner, whilst he was on the scaffold, checked some parts of the execution process, and then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and then a photographer took a final image of Otto Erlandorf, with the executioner and his assistant, and it showed him looking straight at the camera, being very pensive, and he did not appear to show much remorse. The executioner then placed a black cap over his head and then the noose. This was secured, then the trapdoor was released, and instantly Otto Erlandorf was executed, and he was then placed inside of a coffin after his death was confirmed. Otto Erlandorf was responsible for the executions of around 95,000 people, and his actions were horrific and ruthless. He had no regard for the men, women and children who the Einsatzgruppe under his command slaughtered, and his crimes were carried out across much of the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to death for his actions following his trial, and at the age of 44 inside of Landsberg prison on the gallows, Otto Erlandorf's life came to an end. Erich Eelhorst was born on the 5th of February 1906 inside the area of Lorraine on the French-German border. At the time when he was born, this land was part of the German Empire, and he had a rather normal schooling in different cities around Germany, and after he graduated from school, he took a job inside of a rubber factory and studied law for a number of years. But Eelhorst was drawn to the Nazi Party, like so many people were. Adolf Hitler had promised to restore German pride following the defeat of the First World War, and he also promised some better employment opportunities and jobs. Many people flocked to join the Nazi Party, and this included Erich Eelhorst, who officially joined in August 1932, and he was within the first 1.5 million members of the party. But then he became a member of Hitler's Brown Shirts, the SA, in 1933, before he transferred to become a member of the SS the year later. For the Nazis, Eelhorst was someone who they thought had a future and role inside of leadership, especially with regards to the special services. He was given a job inside of the SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, and he was also later given a job within the Gestapo in Berlin. He was transferred to the Gestapo offices in Cologne, and from February 1936 to April 1938, Eelhorst became the head of the Gestapo in the city, and he was then moved to Austria to help impose Nazi rule and will following the Anschluss and annexation of the country into the Third Reich's empire. Whilst this was all happening, he was a member also of the Wehrmacht, but was held in reserve, and he took part in different training, including alongside anti-aircraft soldiers and units. He then, following his work in Cologne, became the head of the Gestapo in Munich, the very city where Hitler had tried to take control of years before. Inside of Munich, he was responsible for interrogating many people who were suspected of resisting Hitler and the Nazis, and he was also known for torturing many of those. But at some point he was even severely disciplined himself by senior SS members for his behaviour. Eelhorst continued to hold different roles linked to the police force, and he was in command of the security police, or the SIPO, in Belarus during the Second World War, and he was then given command of Einsatzkommando 8. These were a mobile killing squad and a subgroup inside of Einsatzgruppe B. They were attached to Army Group Centre, and the soldiers under Eelhorst's command were mobile executioners, who were to round up civilians and people marked for execution and extermination in accordance with the Nazi policies and laws on race. They would usually execute these people in mass shootings, and they walked people out to the edge of their settlements or towns, and they forced them to dig mass graves and pits. Once these were dug, the victims were then led into the pits, and they were forced to stand in front of the executioners, who were stood on the edge of the mass grave. There was also an executioner who sometimes patrolled within the pit, and he ordered the victims to lie on their front, usually on the bodies of those who had gone before, and he then shot a pistol into the nape of their necks. Sometimes this was applied on the edge of the pit, and the victim was then pushed into the mass grave, who was one of those men who was commanding the Einsatzkommando death squads, and his men, as well as shooting, also took part in many hangings and executions in this manner, where locals were strung up from trees or lampposts or anywhere, and this was done to strike fear into the hearts of others, and to make sure they stayed in line with the Nazi regime and the German occupation. He was also given other roles leading Einsatzkommando 1 in Einsatzgruppe A, and his men were known for their slaughter of many civilians. Following a period commanding the death squads in October 1943, he then went back to Germany and was sent to Strasbourg, where he was in charge of the security police yet again. However, whilst here, he got involved in a number of war crimes, including Operation Voldest, in which many villages were burned to the ground in mountain regions to prevent them then being used by Allied soldiers. The villagers who lived here were then sent to concentration camps, or they were forced into slave labour programs. The SS raided many villages, and there were 39 British SAS paratroopers executed during these actions and raids. Eelhorst himself ordered the execution of captured members of the SAS in accordance with Hitler's deadly commando order. Some of these prisoners were taken out to local forests, and they were then shot in the head before they were then buried inside of bomb craters. Eelhorst in 1945 was then moved into the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, and he remained here until April 1945 with the looming threat of the Soviet Red Army in the German capital. But on the 12th of May 1945, he was arrested by American soldiers whilst trying to hide out in southern Bavaria. He was taken to a British military court and was placed on trial for the execution of the British SAS soldiers, and as they were technically prisoners of war, they should have been given some form of care and not been slaughtered and executed where they stood. For this he was sentenced to death, and Eelhorst was then in May 1947 then handed over to the French, as he was then condemned by another court, but this time the French military tribunal judged him. On the 23rd of February 1948, the former chief of the SS and the Einsatzkommando, Erich Eelhorst, was led out to a firing range, and there was a stake ready for him. He had his arms tied together behind his back, and he was secured and tied to the post, ready for the firing squad, and they also made sure his legs were tied together and he could not move. This gave the executioners the best chance of shooting straight into their target. A priest had been appointed to accompany the execution party, and following this the executioners were then made ready. It's not known if Eelhorst had a cap placed over his head or not, and if he would have done, then he would not have seen his executioners. The commander of the firing squad then shouted his men to be ready, and they raised their rifles, and they fired straight into the former SS officer, a man who had given the command for his own executioners to shoot into innocent people during the Second World War. Erich Eelhorst was a man who was known for his sadistic war crimes, and he was someone who had little remorse for his crimes. He had a detailed career inside of the SS, SD and other Nazi organisations that struck terror into the lives of many people, but his deadliest work was done on the Eastern Front, ordering his own firing squads to shoot into innocent people in mass graves. Still today there are many crimes of the Einsatzgruppe which are yet to be uncovered, as people who became victims of them still lie today buried under the earth. Powell Blobel was born in August 1894 in Potsdam, and following schooling he worked as a mason and a carpenter. But as the First World War broke out across Europe, he worked as a carpenter and joined up with the German army and served as an engineer close to the front lines. Blobel received a number of promotions, but at the end of the conflict he remained unemployed in Germany, but studied to become an architect. Following the Wall Street crash, he found himself yet again unemployed, and in December 1931, Powell Blobel joined the Nazi Party, the SA and also the SS. Hitler and his party had promised to restore German pride and to provide the German people with jobs when people were suffering heavily. In 1933, Blobel then joined up with the local police in Dusseldorf, and he was recruited to be an agent in the SD, the intelligence service, but as the Second World War erupted, with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, he was then serving in the SS. The Germans, however, in June 1941 invaded the Soviet Union, and Hitler wanted to take large amounts of land, and his forces rampaged across towards the east. But Powell Blobel then became the chief of Sonderkommando Unit 4A, and he was attached to Einsatzgruppe C. His forces served in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, and as the Wehrmacht advanced to take more land and territory, the Einsatzgruppe, as mentioned, would then arrive and round up civilians and Jews who would then be executed. The executioners would force victims to dig huge pits and graves on the edge of settlements, and they would then in small groups march them into the pits where they were shot by firing squads stood on the edge. Also, individual executioners, armed with pistols, were ready to offer gunshots to the back of the neck inside of the pit too. Blobel, inside of the lands he was overseeing, was put to work establishing a ghetto in the city of Zitomir, and this forced Jews, around 3,000 of them, into a small cramped area before they would then be executed a month later. He was ordered to exterminate the entire Jewish population of the country, and on the 22nd of August 1941 he took part in the Bila Serkva massacre. This was a huge war crime in which the entire adult population of the town was slaughtered by Blobel's Einsatzgruppe, but Blobel even ordered collections of children to be massacred. Blobel was one of the men who gave this specific order, but he continued to slaughter wherever he went. In September 1941 he was involved in organising the Babi Yar massacre, in which, in a ravine near to Kiev, the Einsatzgruppe massacred around 33,000 Jews. Further slaughter continued, but the Einsatzgruppe were commanded by Blobel, and he even received praise by the SS hierarchy for his actions. However, Blobel was sacked, as he was regarded as a drunk, and it was said he was unfit to continue his role leading the execution squads. But after losing his command of the Einsatzgruppe, he was then given a different role, but one which was very important to the Nazis. He oversaw Action 1005, a group that were tasked with covering up and hiding Nazi war crimes, concealing the mass murder of civilians, and Blobel even experimented with the best way of hiding and getting rid of human bodies. He even tried to destroy corpses in forests using incendiary bombs, and his group exhumed en masse the remains of many, and then burned them in huge pyres. Powell Blobel was proud of what he did during the Second World War, and he said of his crimes, "Here lie my 30,000 Jews, near to the site of the Babi Yar massacre." But at the end of the Second World War, he was brought to the Einsatzgruppe trial. Alongside him in the courtroom sat many other commanders of the Nazi death squads. It was said of the trial that, "It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking an active part in the bloody harvest." There were 3 different charges: crimes against humanity, being a member of a criminal organisation, and also war crimes, and Blobel claimed in his testimony and evidence that he was responsible for around 10 to 15,000 deaths. However, the courtroom put forward evidence that he was actually responsible for around 60,000 deaths. He gave detailed accounts of his executions, and in particular what he participated in and ordered at the Babi Yar massacre. But for his crimes he was sentenced to death after being found guilty. It was said by the courtroom that a crime of such unprecedented brutality and of such inconceivable savagery that the mind rebels against its own thought, image, and the imagination staggers in the contemplation of a human degradation beyond the power of language to adequately portray. The number of deaths resulting from the activities with these defendants have been connected, and which the prosecution has set at 1 million, is an abstract number. One cannot grasp the full cumulative terror of murder 1 million times repeated. But Powell Blobel was sent to Landsberg prison to await his execution, and he was on the 7th of June 1951 told about his execution. He was informed shortly before midnight that his execution was to occur imminently, and he was then led out of the prison cell and into the courtyard. Accompanying him were many different members of the American military police, and also a priest who was there to offer him spiritual guidance in his final moments. Blobel was led to the gallows, and his legs had been secured, and then he was helped up the stairs, and his identity was confirmed. He was then handed over to the executioner, who placed the black cap over his head before he was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and the noose was then secured too. After all final checks were performed, the executioner released the trapdoor, and Powell Blobel plunged straight through. After this, his body was then placed inside of a coffin. Powell Blobel was executed alongside a number of horrific Einsatzgruppe commanders, and those men who were responsible for the slaughter of thousands of innocent people during the Second World War. He was a man who was even employed in covering up the Nazi war crimes, and he was someone who seemingly was trusted inside of Himmler's SS, but he was a man responsible for the deaths of around 60,000 people in cold blood. His victims were not soldiers armed with weapons. They were simply innocent men, women and children who were marched into the death pits and then were ruthlessly and horrifically cut down where they stood, usually very close to where they lived. Werner Brauner was born on the 11th of April 1909 inside of Meerstedt, and he had a rather normal early life, attending school, and he then studied at different universities, studying law and the theory of law. But in the 1930s, he was lured into the politics of the Nazi Party, like many people in Germany were, and he joined the Nazi Party at the age of 22 when he was still a student. But people like Werner Brauner, who had a knowledge of law and politics, were seen of use by the Nazis, and in November 1931 he joined the SA, the Stormtroopers or the Brown Shirts as they were known. The SA were at this time seen as the bodyguards of Hitler, and they were also the strongest power in the early 1930s, until they were purged, with the SS being the ones who carried out this attack on Adolf Hitler's orders. Werner Brauner joined the SS in November 1934, and he also worked for the security service known as the SD. Further work inside of police organisations such as the Gestapo continued for Brauner, and he even became the Gestapo leader for the city of Münster. In this work he would be responsible for rounding up resistors and rounding up those who were dissenting to the Nazi regime and Hitler's policies. The Gestapo would brutally torture and deport people to concentration camps too, and this would have been the daily work of Brauner. He was then transferred to become a Gestapo chief in more cities, but as the Second World War broke out, he became appointed as a commander of a horrific set of executioners known as the Einsatzgruppe. The Einsatzgruppe were a collection of SS executioners who would follow the advances of the Wehrmacht and the German army. They would round up people and civilians inside of villages and settlements, sort through these people, and then order huge numbers to go to the outskirts of the settlement. They would then be ordered to dig huge pits, which would become their graves. The people were led into these pits in small groups, where executioners armed with rifles on the edge of the pit would fire into them, instantly killing or seriously injuring. Then executioners would patrol the pit, offering further gunshots. Hundreds of thousands were slaughtered in this way, and Werner Brauner was one of those people who was commanding large numbers of the execution squads. Brauner specifically commanded Special Detachment 11B, which was part of Einsatzgruppe D. He organised and conducted the slaughter of Jews, Soviet commissars and others in the area known as Army Group South Rear Area, in this region. It was a systematic slaughter of huge numbers of people, and his brother would even be a commander inside of the death squads too. Specifically under the command of Werner Brauner, Special Detachment 11B carried out a huge massacre in which in the Crimea, over the course of 3 days, his soldiers slaughtered and murdered 14,500 Jews. They slaughtered all day and all night, and Brauner in September 1942, following being responsible for the deaths of thousands, returned to Halle, and he received a number of different promotions within the SS. He would finish the Second World War as the leader of the German Foreign Service Academy, and he was then dispatched to Norway to serve as a commander of the security police and the SD in the occupied land. But there were many different war criminals who at the end of the Second World War tried to escape and evade any form of justice, and some lived under false papers and names to avoid detection and arrest. It's likely that Brauner would have been advised to do this by Heinrich Himmler, who offered this advice to many different adjutants and SS friends and colleagues. But Brauner was arrested at the end of the Second World War, and his legitimate identity was then discovered. He was then brought before what became known as the Einsatzgruppe Trial, a series of proceedings against 22 former SS leaders who, as commanders of the death squads, took the responsibility for the crimes of those executioners. The indictments included the reports of over 1 million victims, and the court said in its judgment that, In this case, the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killings through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field, actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking active part in the bloody harvest. Werner Brauner, in front of the court, claimed that he was not responsible for the killings, and he said he was only acting upon the orders given to him by his SS superiors and those such as Heinrich Himmler. It was said of him that, in October 1941, he was assigned to Einsatzkommando 11B. As chief of this unit, Brauner knew of the Führer order and executed it to a hilt. His defence is a general one of superior orders, which avails Brauner no more than it does anyone else who executes a criminal order with the zeal that Brauner brought to the Führer order. Various reports implicate Brauner and his commando in the sordid business of illegal killing. The tribunal has already spoken of the Christmas massacre as Simferopol. Brauner was the leader in charge of this operation. He has admitted responsibility for this murder in unequivocal language. On the 10th of April 1948, Brauner was sentenced to death and he was sent to Landsberg prison to await his death sentence. He was on death row for over 3 years inside of the same prison that Adolf Hitler had earlier been incarcerated within. But on the 7th of June 1951, Brauner was told it was his time to die, and he was led from his prison cell towards a courtyard where a large gallows could be found. He was accompanied by a priest and many military policemen that led him up to the gallows and then up the stairs. His arms and legs had been secured, but then he was handed over to the executioner. The executioner performed some final checks before placing the noose and black cap over his head, and Brauner earlier had uttered his final words as he left his prison cell, and he was shouting, "Comrades, long live Germany." Following the final checks, he was then moved over the trapdoor, and was then released through the trap, and the rope went taut, and he was executed. Werner Brauner was a brutal and ruthless executioner who had a long career inside of the SS. He was a man who would oversee the death squads, who performed the slaughter of thousands inside of German-occupied lands. He was one of a number of Einsatzgruppe commandos who were led up to the gallows that day, and he was a man who expressed little remorse for his crimes. At the age of 42 inside of Landsberg prison, the cruelty of Werner Brauner came to an end. On the 29th of April 1905, inside of the town of Meissen in Saxony, Erich Nman was born. It is considered that Nman had a relatively normal early life and upbringing, and that he was given a relatively comfortable schooling. His parents would probably have never believed what a monster and beast he would later become. At the age of 16, Nman left school and he took a job inside of a local business in his hometown. But he was like many people inside of Germany in the late 1920s, attracted to more extreme political groups, and Nman was in particular attracted to the politics of the Nazi Party, who were led by their speaker Adolf Hitler. He was in his mid-20s and he would join the Nazi Party, and inside of the Nazi groups, Nman would be provided with work, promotion and better pay. And of course he would go from being a salesman to a ruthless killer of men, women and children. In 1933 he joined the Braunschers, the SA or Sturmabteilung, and these were the bodyguards of Adolf Hitler, and they were thuggish brutes who were tasked with disrupting the meetings of communists and other opposition political groups, and the SA went further, arranging street wars and fights with the Nazis' enemies. Nman got involved in the chaos and the group, but over a period of time the SA became more of a private army, and their membership numbers were huge, and they actually became a threatening force to Hitler. Because of this, Hitler then ordered a purge, and he ordered his SS, the Schutzstaffel, to purge the SA, the Braunschers, and in this, his close friend and head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, would be slaughtered during the Night of the Long Knives. This led to the executions of many prominent SA members. Nman, being a lower-ranking officer in the group, survived, and he then defected to become part of the SS, and specifically became an officer in the police, and in 1935 he was moved to join the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. The SD was the intelligence sector of the SS led by Reinhard Heydrich, a man referred to by Hitler as the man with the iron heart. Nman, as an SD officer or spy in a sense, was now involved in gathering intelligence and information about those who were the enemies of the Nazis, and this led to the Gestapo rounding up many people who were then sent to early concentration camps such as Dachau. The SD worked closely with the Gestapo and other groups, and Nman remained in the group for many years and was promoted a number of times, rising to the rank of SS Brigade Führer. But his involvement with Reinhard Heydrich and the SS would lead during the Second World War to Nman to take more of a hands-on approach to the crimes of the Nazis. The Einsatzgruppe were a collection of paramilitary death squads which were established by the SS and the Nazis, and during World War II they carried out the exterminations of millions of people. As the German army pushed into new lands and established their occupation, the Einsatzgruppe would come in and follow, and they would sort out and gather large swathes of the civilian population. They sorted out those who were to become slave labourers, and those who were to be killed were marched to the edge of the settlements, where they were ordered to dig huge pits at gunpoint. These people were digging their own graves. After this was done, the victims would then be led into the pits, and they would be either shot by a firing squad or by a lone executioner who walked inside the pit with his pistol, firing a shot into the back of the neck. These victims were told to lie down on the bodies of those who had gone before, and they were then executed. It was industrial mass killing and slaughter, and in this way millions across Eastern Europe were killed at the hands of the Einsatzgruppe. Erich Nman was one of the most trusted members of the SS, and as soon as the Second World War broke out in Europe, he was given command of Einsatzgruppe 6, and during the invasion of Poland, his forces would round up 6,000 people, and they would shoot them in the manner outlined earlier. Most of the people who became victims to Nman's executioners were priests, teachers, and those members of the Polish intelligentsia, as well as political activists. Erich Nman continued to work in the Einsatzgruppe, and he was made the chief of Einsatzgruppe B in November 1941. He was now in charge of more groups of death squads, and his forces shot more people. After the Germans invaded the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppe shot huge numbers, thousands every single day. Erich Nman claimed in November 1941 to his superior Adolf Eichmann that his men had shot in the region of Smolensk 17,256 people. His group mostly used gunshot to execute their victims, but they occasionally utilised gas vans. By December 1942, his own Einsatzgruppe men had executed 134,298 people at least. Let's remember that Erich Nman was just one of many commanders too. He continued to also witness many of the killings himself, and he was not a pen pusher stuck behind a desk, but instead he went right to the front and witnessed much of the shooting himself. This gained him a notorious reputation, and the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was impressed by his disastrous work that he was doing, and because of this, Nman was then made the commander of the security police and the SD in the occupied Netherlands. Whilst there he continued to slaughter, torture and execute, and did use groups of executioners against the Dutch people. However, as the Second World War went badly for the Germans, following the Battle of Stalingrad, some of the SS members and higher-ranking members of the group began to consider their futures. They knew they would be wanted for war crimes, and Himmler would advise his top men, like Nman, to gain false identities and to try and avoid detection at the end of the war. But Erich Nman fell into the hands of the Allies, and his crimes were revealed during his interrogation. He was brought to a war crimes trial alongside other members of the Einsatzgruppe, and he was sat with a number of other commanders. In the judgment at the trial it was said, "In this case the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killings through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking active part in the bloody harvest." Nman and his fellow defendants were said to have been responsible for over 1 million people, and he claimed he was just following orders which were given to him. Nman also said that he believed that the destructive and deadly work he was doing was not wrong, and he said that, I quote, No, Your Honour, I consider the decree to be right, because it was part of our aim of our war, and therefore it was a necessity. He believed he had been assigned to do a job executing civilians, and said he had no issues with doing this. The courtroom asked for further information, saying, "Then the tribunal will accept from your answer that you saw nothing wrong with the orders, even though it did involve the killing of defenceless human beings. That is what we draw from your answer." Eric Nman replied with, "Yes, Your Honour," giving confirmation to his work, and he had no guilt about the fact he'd overseen the slaughter of well over 100,000 people inside of the occupied lands. It was no surprise when the death sentence was passed against Eric Nman, and he was sent to Landsberg prison to await the date of his execution, and the former Einsatzgruppe commander actually remained on death row for roughly 3 years. It was on the 7th of June 1951, a short while before midnight, that Eric Nman was informed that it was time for his execution. He made the short walk out of his prison cell, accompanied by many American military policemen and a priest. The priest was there to provide spiritual guidance in his final moments, and he was led into the courtyard of Landsberg prison, where the gallows was found. Eric Nman had his identity confirmed at the bottom of the steps, and he was then helped up the gallows steps as his arms had been secured behind him. When he got to the top of the steps, the priest recorded his final words, and the executioner took possession of him. He ensured his arms were tied tightly behind his back, and then his legs were tied together, and he was shuffled over the trapdoor. Nman then had a final photograph taken as he was stood on the gallows, and when everything was ready, the former Einsatzgruppe commander was sent crashing through the trapdoor, and a black cap had been placed over his head. Eric Nman was a brutal and barbaric commander of the Einsatzgruppe, and he was someone who had no problem with carrying out executions and deaths of so many people on the Eastern Front. He showed absolutely no remorse, and for his crimes, at the age of 46, the ruthless Nman was sent crashing through the gallows to his death. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.